Welcome, welcome, welcome. My name is Jack Brewer, and this is the Wayward Sons Book Club, sponsored by Expanding Frontiers Research. Tonight, we will be reading and discussing Chapter 4 of Wayward Sons, NICAP and the IC. The chapter deals with Nicolas de Rochefort, an intriguing man who seems to have been somewhat of a utility player in intelligence agencies around the Beltway and somehow ended up helping organize NICAP in its early stages. So we'll be discussing that. We also recently received some new records that we didn't have at the time I wrote the book on Nicolas de Rochefort. They are FBI records recently obtained from the National Archives, and we will also be discussing the nuances as well as some of the overt things carried in those records. But before we get started, how is everyone doing tonight?
Very good.
Thank you. Thank you. Any thoughts left over from last week or observations about what we're about to delve into? Not yet. All right. I thought that we would read about the first 3.5 pages of chapter 4 and then pause and discuss some of it. Would anyone like to volunteer to read those first 3.5 pages, please?
I have the book on Kindle. I'm happy to start, but I wonder how far do I need to go through?
Or just a page or two, if you prefer, and then someone else.
I'll read along until it sounds like a
Sure.
appropriate place to start.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay, Chapter 4, Count de Rochefort. Nicolas de Rochefort was reportedly born May 1st, 1902, in St. Petersburg, Russia. He was the son of a Russian woman and a Frenchman who was in the country to represent French financial interests. The Rocheforts are one of France's oldest families, members of which fought in the Crusades. Nicolas graduated from a French military academy and the School of Law in the University of Paris. He also earned a doctorate from a higher education science institution in France. During World War II, he served as a captain in the French army and was captured by German troops. Rochefort subsequently faked an illness and remarkably tricked his captors into releasing him from a prisoner of war camp. This may have been among the first successful acts of psychological warfare undertaken by a man destined to be recognized as an expert in the field. When the Allies later launched an invasion, Rochefort was among them in the 1st French Armored Division. He spoke 5 languages and wrote numerous articles for political science journals. Count de Rochefort came to the United States in 1949 on a lecture tour. In 1954, he renounced his French citizenship and title to become an American citizen. He went on to be a professor at American University and to live in Georgetown, where he resided when he passed away due to cancer in 1964. Rochefort wrote and spoke for Voice of America, a state-controlled international television and radio network founded in 1942 and funded by the U.S. federal tax budget. The World War II POW grew global attention in 1954 when he helped lead Freedom Day, a celebration led in Berlin, New Hampshire, which honored East German resistance to communism. Rochefort's heavily attended speech was broadcast internationally in 3 languages by Voice of America. Remarks by Wisconsin Representative Charles Kirsten about Rochefort and his Freedom Day co-organizer, Dr. Charles Lowry, were entered into the 1954 congressional record. Kirsten emphasized the advantageous impact abroad of the event and stated to Congress on July 29, 1954, a lesson can be drawn from this experience. Two men of small financial means, but armed with imagination, perseverance, and knowledge of methods and techniques of psychological warfare, were able to plan and carry out an operation of this nature, and finding assistance and aid from the part of the American people. Such projects as this, staged in America, implemented by American citizens and groups of citizens, can better be worked out, prepared, and initiated by private initiative than the government. It would therefore be desirable to create a private organization for this very purpose, the members of which would devote all their time and their skill to devising actions of unconventional psychological warfare, inspire and coordinate them. It would not require millions of dollars. Relatively modest sums would suffice. Rochefort and his associates were way ahead of Representative Kirsten. In 1953, Nicolas de Rochefort was credited with founding the Committee of 1 Million against the admission of Red China to the United Nations. The DC-based lobbying group was known as the Committee, just as the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena would later be called at times, and which Rochefort helped organize in 1956. As the 1953 committee full name implies, it opposed the domestic and international acceptance of Communist China.
Thank you. Let's pause there for a moment. And we can see, like, one of the things I wanted to express here in this chapter is that as we see in a lot of UAP, UFO circles today, these men were not obscure aspects of American culture. And in fact, if the historians are aware of these people like Nicolas de Rochefort and many of the NICAP board members, and would know much more about them than I do, but would consider their UFO activity a very small part of their overall careers, if they're even aware of it. And to me, that seemed all the more significant, that like this immigrant that we're going to learn more about as the chapter goes somehow got involved with NICAP. Any thoughts or comments on that?
I'm just curious, do we know how he actually pronounced his name? Did he pronounce it like the French, like Rochefort, instead of, or did he like with the T and Rogue?
I do not know. Allison asked that before we started recording. I came up with the pronunciation because I had some customers in another business that spelled their last name that way and pronounced it Rochefort. So I just went with de Rochefort. But it may very well, I may very well be butchering the French pronunciation. Any other thoughts?
Yes, I wrote in the margins here, I couldn't believe that the representative actually said that it would be desirable to create private organizations basically for psychological warfare, using psychological warfare. I was like, he actually said that. To me, it's just like they're talking about it out loud, because And nowadays, you're considered fringe if you talk about the reality of current psychological warfare.
Indeed. Yes, indeed. Sharon Weinberger interviewed John Alexander in an article that is in I think it was the 2007 Washington Post. And he was Colonel John Alexander, a decorated military career officer and CIA consultant, among other agencies. And yes, that was during the Guantanamo Bay days. And he was just openly discussing that a new generation of Congress people were interested in what CIA had learned through MK Ultra and mind control techniques that weren't around for the church committee hearings and things like that. And it didn't have that negative connotation that it might to people that know more about it and that it should have. And yeah, they were standing on the gas pretty hard in the 50s with and I think that's something that deserves bearing in mind as we proceed with Mr. de Rochefort's affiliations with the State Department and the Department of Commerce and apparently the CIA. What we now know that those agencies were doing in 1950, 1951, 1953.
Because isn't it actually illegal to perform psychological warfare operations on American citizens?
That's a good question. I do not know. I don't have legal expertise in that area, but I think that it is kind of one of those open secrets. I think you're right that the CIA would, like its public affairs office would say, we don't even conduct operations in the United States, and like one of those, but everybody knows kind of things, I think. Yeah.
That's a good question, Jeff. I hadn't thought about that. Especially in context to like what Jim Stewartson and Heidi Kuda almost got. They had written a speech for Biden to give to call out what was going on, and it was psychological warfare going on in our country. And it didn't end up happening. He didn't end up giving the speech, but I find it interesting to think now that maybe it has something to do with the fact that you'd have to call out who's doing the psychological warfare, and it probably involved people in the United States. So maybe that's the consideration there.
This says it's illegal for the U.S. military to conduct psychological operations.
So if, say, someone's not in the military and they're a disgraced retired general, they could still do it because it's not part of the military.
Well, it's illegal for the government, according to military and federal law. They're prohibited from subjecting U.S. civilians to psychological operations or propaganda of any means. Which, I mean, of course, they do it anyways. Like, right. But it's actually, according to the ACLU, it's illegal for them to do any of that with U.S. citizens. So, yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting because it seems to follow a culture, like regardless of the law, like what Beltway attorneys, Beltway judges, Beltway intelligence officers are willing to consider to be the norm seems to be more the thing, doesn't it?
I was just surprised that this Freedom Day celebration was described as psychological warfare.
Yeah.
It didn't really seem like it to me. It's just like the celebration of You know, I don't know what, just the activism against the East Germans. I don't know.
I think that's part of it too. And that's a great point that, like, I recall when I was doing some other research, I came across a division of British intelligence that had a substantial platoon that they called its Facebook warriors. And they conducted operations on Facebook. And it was just kind of like you could, it's just a matter of perspective. Like you could get on either side of it. Like if they're doing posting information that's patriotic and they're trying to counter anti-Western narratives from adversaries in the East and the Middle East, you'd kind of consider them failing at their jobs if they didn't do it. Yet there is something just inherently disturbing about, look, I'm just on Facebook to share photos with my daughter. What do you mean it's a military war zone? Which is what the Marines described the internet for a while, was a war zone.
Wow.
Yeah, there was a time during that same time, like the 90s, I think it was, early 2000s, that Marines were discouraged, if not prohibited, from being online if it wasn't part of their official orders, because there's just nothing good, really. That was the thinking. There's just nothing good that can come out of you having classified or secret or mission sensitive information, and you're going to go fool around on a single site or just talk football with your buddies that all have screen names or whatever. Just, you're either a Marine or you're a fantasy football player, but you're not going to be both, kind of thing.
That kind of reminds me of the news stories about like Secret Service agents who have like fitness trackers that their activities get posted online, so you can track the locations of world leaders because they're, Secret Service agents are exercising and it gets posted online.
Yeah, and that's like what the concerns have been of security personnel that are like, how, the president and public officials just go to events in South Florida and whatnot that are open to the public, and they're there with, phones that aren't secure, and
Yeah.
it's, just a security nightmare as I understand it. Who'd like to read some?
I guess I will.
Thank you, Jeff.
All right. The China lobby, as activists rejecting Red China and often supporting the nation's former regime were known, raised big bucks and were accused of employing vast amounts of propaganda to influence policy and opinion. Some felt that the lobbies disingenuously characterized the Chinese government's predecessor favorably while ignoring its corruption, all of which, it was argued, left citizens with the short end of the economic stick, while bureaucrats, politicians, and warmongers got fat. The China lobby of the late 1940s to early 1960s was so influential in America, wrote investigative journalist Robert Sherrill in the New York Times, that normal relations with mainland China were delayed at least a generation while we continued to support the burdensome and corrupt Chiang Kai-shek's government in retreat. Also, the China lobby infected our foreign policy with such fear of red hordes as to contribute to our panicky commitment in Vietnam. Sherrill's 1977 Times article, Buying American Foreign Policy, cited the work of some of his fellow investigative reporters who asserted no foreign lobby in Washington had ever been as rich or powerful, or interfered so insidiously in the American governmental process. The most well-known part of that rich and powerful China lobby, Sherrill reported, was the Committee of 1 Million. That's quite a CV being compelled by Rochefort. Among the works cited in Cheryl's piece was that of Stanley D. Bachrach, author of the 1976 nonfiction book, The Committee of 1 Million. Who dreamed up the committee? Cheryl continued. Bachrach suspects that one of the committee's founders, Nicolas de Rochefort, a former French military expert in psychological warfare, was working for the Central Intelligence Agency, and that the committee may have been one of the CIA's ideas. But so far, Bachrach's efforts to open the CIA files have been frustrated in court. Another founder, and perhaps the committee's most ardent executive, was Congressman Walter Judd, a former medical missionary who sincerely viewed the Democratic Party of FDR Truman as a satanic host. Bachrach suspects that Judd may have secretly used the House subcommittee in a dubious, if not illegal way to launch the lobby. But again, his efforts to get to the subcommittee's secret records have been frustrated by federal rules. Please allow me to emphasize characters found in the overlapping of UFOs and the intelligence community often have significant roles in political circles. This is repeatedly the case, and I would include more current-day circumstances in that assessment as well. I do not find this coincidental or inconsequential. I'm of the opinion that official involvement of intelligence professionals, members of Congress, and similar figures in the UFO subculture is rarely, if ever, primarily fueled by their interest in UFOs. That just might falsely appear to be the case to those who themselves are passionate about UFOs and may view the circumstances with a bit of UFO tunnel vision. Moreover, NICAP became further entrenched in politics as our story unfolds. The trail of Stanley Bachrach's effort to gain access to CIA records takes us to the U.S. District Court for the Central District of California. It was at court in 1975 that Stanley D. Bachrach versus the CIA, William Colby, was filed. The lawsuit sought all information on then-deceased Nicolas de Rochefort relations with the CIA and its predecessor organizations. Judge William P. Gray presided over and subsequently dismissed the case. Judge Gray explained in his 1976 ruling, as documented in a CIA study on security classification released to the public in 2012. While there's a strong public interest in the public disclosure of the functions of government agencies, there's also a strong public interest in the effective functioning of an intelligence service, which could be greatly impaired by irresponsible disclosure. The 188-page, including notes, CIA study observed specifically about Bachrach's effort to obtain records potentially pertaining to Rochefort. Through the decisions of these district courts, a series of precedents is emerging which have already greatly enhanced the legal stature of sources and methods as an independent means of protecting intelligence information, at least in the context of FAOI requests for information. I tried unsuccessfully to obtain the Bachrach versus CIA case file. The California District Court informed me by email in 2020 that searches were conducted in response to my inquiry, but the case was probably destroyed or not recorded. During correspondence with the court, it referred me to the National Archives at Riverside, which located and provided a small docket file. The gist of the file is contained in the image below, which suggests dismissal of the case.
Thank you, Jeff. Let's pause there for a few minutes. Yeah, this was the docket record that I got from the National Archives at Riverside. And it does have there in 1976 some reference to the case being dismissed. It also has an interesting reference there, April 20th, 76, that there were motions and arguments about the judge having an in-camera inspection of the records. And I find that kind of interesting because that's something that we've been involved with at Expanding Frontiers Research. If we do a request and an agency declines it, then the next step, at least in the Utah jurisdiction we were working in, was to file an appeal. And then the appeal was denied. So then we file an appeal to an authoritative body, which was a council for the state on appeals. And they did what was called an in-camera interview of the documents to make a ruling on our argument that the exemptions being cited weren't applicable. And we won that ruling. But my point being, for there to be an in-camera interview or an in-camera viewing would mean there were records. So, I mean, there would have to be. So that doesn't give us proof, but there's a lot of smoke here. I think we could agree about Nicolas de Rochefort's potential involvement with the CIA. Just the fact he was even working on that committee of 1 million, for one thing, and that Congressman Judd, who was such a right-wing congressman, had interest in Mr. de Rochefort, would suggest he wasn't just your average guy off the street that was willing to help out. Do you guys agree with that assessment or have another view of it?
It's just crazy to me that how the government can still claim things like sources and methods or anything on documents that are over 75 years old in the first place. Like, in my opinion, there's nothing that they should be hiding that's that old, like, no matter what it was. Like, it's just crazy to me.
Yeah, that is an interesting part of it, that I think it specifically even states that time is not a factor, which is not practical at all, just not at all. It seems like it should be a primary factor. And the records we just got, I already have submitted an appeal for the withholding of information because of sources and methods and government operations. And I argued that it's, of more value to historians than it could possibly be sensitive intelligence information at this point in time. They're literally records from the 1950s that are redacted. Yeah.
Everyone's dead, pretty much, that was involved with any of it. So, like, what does it matter?
Which, in FBI's defense, that's a big thing. They base their disclosure of records on as compared to other agencies. If you can come up with a death certificate or an obituary, they will then process files on an individual. The CIA will not. The only way the CIA will do it, and I've tried on de Rochefort again just in case, but the only way the CIA will process records is if they have publicly made a declaration of a relationship with the individual. Like, they don't care whose book it is. They don't care if it's in the New York Times. They don't care if the individual says it on Coast to Coast or CNN or anywhere else. If it's not an official CIA statement, then they still are going to plead Glomar, which is neither confirmed nor denied, because judges, as happened in de Rochefort's case, have pretty much given them leeway that, and I don't entirely disagree, that the nature of intelligence work requires them to lie about who they're involved with. It's kind of one of those catch-22 things, apocalypse now, Colonel Curse's mentality that if you're going to go to war, well, then kill everybody, yeah, it gets hard to apply practicality to some of it, right?
Well, and especially since sources and methods have probably changed quite a bit since we now have, like, say, the internet, right? Like, I mean, I know some things stay the same, but like over 75 years, I don't know what they'd be compromising by disclosure.
I'm not saying it necessarily would apply to this case, but the answer to the implied question would be that agencies don't like to embarrass themselves. And if they've denied something for 60 years, they don't like saying that was part of the operation, was to deny it, or they don't like to, they particularly don't like to show that a lot of resources went into keeping something secret that may have not even produced anything of value. And that's often the arguments that we make in our appeals. There's a FOIA wiki that if people are interested, you can go to, and you can read the different FOIA exemptions that agencies will cite. And this is an open source wiki. So people that successfully appeal these exemptions will post how they appealed it and what, so you can go there and you can get case precedents and records that were released and what the arguments were. And one of the arguments for that is it's not a matter of national security to save an agency from embarrassment, that it's not the same thing. And some NatSec attorneys will even argue it kind of is sometimes, you know, if their credibility and dignity and whatnot. But as we all know, law is a practice, and it just kind of depends on the attorneys and the judges as to how it gets sorted out. But they haven't come off de Rochefort, and they doesn't look like they're going to anytime soon unless we can get some pretty competent attorneys to get a fire in their belly about it.
Well, you had a comment earlier. You said that you wrote, "That's quite a CV being compiled by Rochefort." And it just reminded me of a couple of chapters ago where you described Arnold Krukman as like a most interesting man in the world type of guy. And it just seems kind of interesting that this flying saucer club that kind of spun off into NICAP attracted the attention of these at least two very well-connected and influential men. You know, it doesn't seem like doesn't seem like the dots connect there.
It doesn't at all. And I think I mentioned too, the more I drilled down in this, the more conspiratorial it became to me rather than less. No, it doesn't seem to make sense at all. I think that's where we often consider conspiracy theories, is when it's hard to imagine someone is as incompetent as their actions are suggesting. Like, for someone that could accomplish the things Krukman accomplished, to be writing a sitting congressman about there might be thousands upon thousands of people from other planets roaming freely in the United States. It's hard to imagine how he may have believed that, you know, like you can kind of understand that, well, in like, you know, the 1950s, they hadn't had probes go to Venus, that, you know, people were literally thinking Mars has canals and things like that. So you can kind of understand it. But when their actions just contradict what they say they do, you know, it gets difficult to think that that's just where conspiracies come from and build on, you know. Okay, at this part, in March 2021, we start getting into some of the records that I obtained in the past. So I'll read a little bit there and try to post some things too. In March 2021, the CIA responded to my 2020 FOIA request on material pertaining to Nicolas de Rochefort. It stated, in short, a search indicated no records responsive that would reveal a publicly acknowledged affiliation between the CIA and the subject. The agency would neither confirm nor deny any records might exist that would reveal a classified association, as such records would be exempt from disclosure under the FOIA. I thought the request was worth a try. In the event, files surrounding the Baccarat lawsuit had found their way into the light of day by this point in time. They had not. So our profile of Nicolas de Rochefort thus far suggests he was an honorable World War II veteran. Educated and politically active, Mr. Rochefort assisted Voice of America and became recognized as an expert in psychological warfare. While heavily involved in such activities, he sought American citizenship in 1954. Rochefort held influence within the China lobby at the time, a demographic credited as among the wealthiest and most powerful lobbies in Washington. He numbered among the founders of the Committee of 1 Million, a suspected brainchild of the CIA, and considered the most high-profile aspect of that China lobby. To learn more about this man, who curiously became an organizer of NICAP in 1956 and briefly instrumental in its early operation, we turn to the FBI. In 2020, the Bureau responded to my FOIA request on Nicolas de Rochefort with a 29-page file. It consists of several 1956 and 1957 documents pertaining to investigations on de Rochefort. Some of the investigations were conducted under the Foreign Agents Registration Act. As explained at the website of the National Archives and Records Administration, the act required foreign propagandists or agents of a foreign principal engaged in distributing propaganda to register with the State Department. The Bureau conducted related investigations. I think it is an extremely reasonable suspicion Rochefort's request for American citizenship in 1954 was related to his line of work, whatever exactly that line of work may have been. FBI concerns reflected in the 29-page file include if Rochefort was employed by nationalist China. The Bureau eventually seemed to have established to its satisfaction that was not the case, and noted those familiar with Rochefort often considered his anti-communist proclamations to be sincere. That was, of course, important to J. Edgar Hoover's agents. Perhaps most curious to our exploration of the mysterious Count de Rochefort is the timing of memos written by Director Hoover and reports composed by FBI special agents during their investigations. The file contains reports composed on the bullseye of the timeline in which we're most interested, late 1956 and early 1957, when NICAP was incorporated and launched. The Bureau seems to have been conducting an SGE, or Special Government Employee investigation, running concurrently with the Registration Act matter. This is an August 1956 airtel from Hoover to the FBI Washington field office. Hoover's message seems to suggest the Registration Act investigation was conducted for the State Department, as we might expect. The SGE case may have been related to Rochefort's employment with the Department of Commerce, as perhaps inferred by the term Commerce SGE. Subsequent FBI reports would also indicate Rochefort was periodically employed by the State Department. An August 1956 FBI report was written by Special Agent Duncan McCrae of the Washington field office. Quite notably, McCrae cited a file on Rochefort at the State Department that indicated Rochefort was employed by the U.S. government in Washington, D.C. The employment took place from October 1, 1952 to May 31, 1954. That would have been before Rochefort was granted American citizenship, and during the time he was suspected of working on behalf of the CIA on the Committee of 1 Million, as suggested by Stanley Backrath. The top of the first page of McCrae's report, referencing Rochefort's work with the U.S. government, the Committee of 1 Million, and a group known as the Advertising Council. And we can see that here. That consultant for Advertising Council, that's like you guys were observing that they throw that term psychological warfare around pretty liberally. We're going to be getting more into a group called Counsel Services that was a public relations firm, and that comes up a lot during that time, that that the psychological warfare people were considered advertisers, like advertising agencies and things like that. And it reminds me, some of you may have heard of a man named Lansdale, a General Lansdale, that was recruited into the CIA and he ended up a general. He wasn't when he was recruited. He was a Madison Avenue executive and a talented madman, and was very good at what he did, and rose through the intelligence services to the point of eventually even being a presidential advisor. And that just comes to mind with these references to advertising agencies and corporations, you know? I submitted a FOIA request to the State Department for the above referenced file on Rochefort. It suggested I seek the file from the National Archives and Records Administration. In 2020, NARA responded that a search of records spanning from 1945 to 1959 located a single document, a 1951 letter. There was no explanation offered as to whether the requested State Department file cited to the FBI report may have been lost, destroyed, or perhaps some other circumstance. The document provided was a letter from the office of House Majority Leader Congressman John W. McCormack of Massachusetts. It was written by an aide, apparently to a State Department official, endorsing the services of Nicolas de Rochefort and suggesting an existing professional relationship of some capacity with the congressman. You can see that it was from the officer of the congressman to an assistant secretary for public affairs at the Department of State, and the congressman's aide specifically referenced the interest in de Rochefort, and this was just one of many. This just like shows the general nature of the files, just repeatedly says yes, he could be of help to the State Department. And so that suggests an existing relationship too, as early as 1951. And we will get into some more of that as we go. Turning our attention back to the August 1956 FBI report, the investigation reflected statements. The investigation reflected statements of the president of the Advertising Council. He described Rochefort as a good propagandist, particularly valuable in projects designed to counter communist propaganda. Rochefort's employment activities are described in another report by Special Agent McCrae, dated November 27, 1956. The investigation period covered dates between mid-September and mid-November. NICAP was incorporated October 24, 1956, after some preparation. A synopsis of the FBI report, which credits Rochefort with conception and promotion of the Committee of 1 Million, is pictured, and we can see that it references an INS file and a Civil Service Commission investigation, that Rochefort is credited with conceiving and promoting the Committee for 1 Million. That's a pretty big task for someone that just got to town, isn't it? And then the Department of Commerce revealed that he was appointed in June 1956, employed by the State Department through 1957, which is just, again, right on the bullseye of the NICAP timeline. And he was verified to have done work for the Advertising Council on a project to counter communist propaganda, we can see there. Do you guys have any comments at this point?
I just wonder how many of these people that work in things like the Office of International Trade Affairs have anything to do with trade fairs and actual trade.
That's a really good point. Like, because I want to stress that too, and I don't want to sound like a mystery monger, or I don't want to like sound overly conspiratorial, but the people that helped incorporate NICAP were apparently CIA and State Department assets that had worked in the Commerce Department. And that's going to become increasingly significant. And I was looking today. I was double checking the Office of the Historian for the State Department's website, because there's a link where you can go look that people that were involved in Project PB Success, that was the operation that the CIA funded a coup in Guatemala, and at this point considers it a successful operation and something it's proud of. So they have a lot of material up about it. And the State Department's historian's website even has a section where you can look at people's names and the code names and aliases they used during that era. So I'm occasionally going back and trying to check all these different pen names and all of these whatever, just aliases that different people had that I come across in the FBI, because yes, a number of them were involved in this story. And it's a really good point that as one person put it to me once, that was in a position to know, if there's foreign aid going to another government, then there is intelligence involved. Like that's the price of helping you with your crops, of helping you educate your people, of whatever this international development or commerce, or at that point with Guatemala, there was a fruit company out of New Orleans that was really influential, and they had annual sales and revenue that were higher than many third world countries. I think they had more money than Guatemala, and that was one of the covers that they were using, and more of that will come up. But that's a really good point, Jeff, is people see the trade commission, or they see a diplomat, or they see worked at an embassy, and they don't see it as the same way as if they say, was a CIA case officer assigned to the Moscow office. And they should, they should see it similar as CIA case officer assigned to the Guatemala station. Yeah, that should be similar as State Department official that was working in Guatemala in 1953. Yes.
Jack, my comment just has to do with the fact that if seems like they're very concerned about communist sentiment. I don't know if you have, or maybe this comes up later, how this plays into them being part of NICAP or creating NICAP. Were they afraid? Although it doesn't make sense if they were the ones that created NICAP, but like, are they afraid that there's more pro-communist sentiment that needs to be?
I think there is. I'm sure Jeff could speak to this some. Randy may be familiar with it too. One of the concerns the FBI expressed that we know now, maybe they didn't in the 1950s, but there were people calling themselves UFO contactees, and their message was often about global peace and doing away with nuclear arms. And it gets pretty convoluted, but this was viewed as an anti-American sentiment, which again, you kind of got a, sympathy for the apocalypse now people that the FBI was concerned about contactees like Adamski and others that were saying the message they were getting from their alien friends was suspiciously similar to like what Jane Fonda would have had to say, just to cut to the chase. And for those that know that reference. And so one might see an FBI and CIA interest in, as you've mentioned, controlling the narrative, being the opposition, having the argument, being controlled opposition, being the people that are claiming to be pro UFO, so leak me your documents and see where your leaks are. I can't imagine they wouldn't have been interested in at least investigating that further, you know, like it'd be their job, wouldn't it?
Well, now that gives me the context to make sense why they would even establish something like NICAP in order to counter, or at least be there to catch or those sentiments and counterbalance them.
It gets insane, Allison. It gets crazy. If you want to go far enough with it, William Dudley Pelley expressed an interest in promoting some of the contactees. And I have some, and he was a far right-wing extremist fascist, went to prison for sedition. I have suspicions he went to an alien storyline because part of his condition of parole was that he couldn't write political rhetoric anymore. And so it just gets crazy. And see, this is why people that are like interested in flying saucers, like I can understand them saying, I don't know about all that, Jack. I just want to know what kind of triangle craft can we like establish actually existed in 1980. I saw a triangle craft. Did they have them yet? I can understand that interest. I just got to where I really don't think you can look at the UFO topic as a whole without knowing all of this Cold War stuff and where it came from, you know? And again, it does just get insane that the FBI and the right-wing extremists and maybe some sincere peace activists, you know, Greenwich Village types, are all in the same space and none of them trust anybody. And then you have the common enemy, kind of the marriage of the left and the right, that they just distrust authority. And we still have that today, you know, like in the yoga movement and the health movement, that they share a commonality with the far right of just not trusting government. And
right.
And government's given us some good reasons not to trust them from time to time.
Which that creates the horseshoe. It closes up the horse, right? So there's no longer, they meet in on that basis alone of the distrust. Wow.
The interesting thing though about some of those concerns about contactees being communists and whatnot is, like, as their message aside, most of those guys were actually like extremely patriotic nationalists, like, you know, like Pelley, like was far right, like super patriot in his mind, like nationalist kind of character. And so were a lot of the other contactees. They're actually very pro-American. They weren't like, you know, communist sympathizers like in the least. And I wonder if NICAP was the one organization at the time pushing back against the contactee narrative. They didn't really want any part of that. If that's entirely Kehoe because he thought it was silly, or if there was other influences, as to why NICAP was pushing back against the contactee kind of.
That's a really good point. Yeah, that like if FBI was anti-contactee message, which we know they were, well, then what does that say about NICAP pushing back against it? And yeah, there's a whole line of thought here that would go into Donald Kehoe was the tour manager for the aviation guy that was famous, Lindbergh.
That's right.
That was a spokesperson with the National Socialist Party and was tied into the now infamous event in Madison Square Garden. And I have my suspicions that that may have been how Krugman and Kehoe kind of knew each other. And then, yeah, you've got complications with Pelley and the contactees, and like the letter that Krugman wrote T. Townsend Brown. I thought that was kind of chilling that he said it has to be like Caesar's wife and you have to be completely clean and on the level. That's just such an odd thing to say to somebody if you're not aware of things they're doing that aren't on the level, Like I wouldn't write that in an email to any of y'all,
I'm back in place. Rachel Maddow did the podcast in the book. Was it prequel? I have that. Or was it? What was it called recently?
Ultra.
Ultra. Yes. And she talks a lot about Pelley in that. And about that time frame.
Yeah, Pelley had a publication called Soulcraft, like Jack said, after he got out of jail and got into the UFO flying saucer circuit. And famous contactee, one of the most famous contactees of like the 50s was George Hunt Williamson. And he actually had a regular column in Pelley's little magazine journal that he put out. Wow. You can actually go read all of them. They're all on this website, iapsop.com, I think, where they archive like old newsletters like that. You can actually go read all that stuff.
Yeah, and we've got records up at the EFR blog on Truman Bethram, who was a self-described contactee. And the FBI had an informant get a hold of their Cincinnati office when Bethram came to Cincinnati to sell tickets and have a public speaking engagement. And the FBI agent documented how George Hunt Williamson was there, and they documented that, further investigation reveals he writes for Pelley. And the agent just knew there's no introduction required to Director Hoover about who Pelley is. And that comes up. That lack of introduction is something you learn to kind of watch for. There's a memo, shout out to Jeffrey Kay again, that he took an interest in with me as well. There's a memo where Alan Dulles and J. Edgar Hoover were meeting with top presidential advisors about the Korean alleged brainwashing of pilots and stuff like that. And in one of these memos that the FBI agent is just making a memo for the record of what was discussed, he mentions that they talked about Joseph Bryan and him knowing these pilots and things, and they don't, and it doesn't go into who Bryan is. And it's like, so obviously everybody in that meeting is who, and Joseph Bryan was a NICAP board member and CIA asset. And it's like, and like Jeffrey Kay and I observed, clearly no introduction was necessary, you know? So again, yeah, these NICAP guys were not some fringe aspect of Washington here. These were people known in these groups, yes. Sources cited in McCrae's report include an INS file, which is Immigration and Naturalization Service, and a 1955 investigation conducted by the CSC, or Civil Service Commission. Also described in the synopsis is Roquefort's June 7, 1956 appointment to the Department of Commerce and subsequent July to September leave pending security clearance. Note Roquefort's employment as well, and I will pull this back up since we're looking at it here. Note Roquefort's employment as well with the State Department during what would have been his involvement with NICAP. The FBI notably verified Roquefort's previous employment at the Advertising Council on a project to counter communist propaganda. McCrae's report goes on to cite the CSC as establishing Roquefort's interactions and apparent good standing with Colonel John Splain of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Roquefort reportedly met with such officials in the Pentagon and abroad on behalf of those backing the Committee of 1 Million, including the previously referenced Congressman Judd. Topics of discussion included Freedom Day in Berlin, New Hampshire. The next page of McCrae's November report references Roquefort's substantial responsibility in the development of the committee. Leadership of the lobby group described Roquefort as a highly convincing speaker and credited him with writing a petition which received nearly 1 million signatures. The executive director of the committee was also tapped by investigators. He stated that he worked closely with Roquefort, who he described as doing an outstanding job at bringing the issues before the American people about Red China's admission to the United Nations. He explained the entire idea of the petition originated with Roquefort, or we might wonder, with the CIA, as Stanley Bachrach suspected. S.A. McCrae's November 1956 report referenced the August FBI investigation pertaining to background checks for government employees. The investigation established Roquefort was projected to be employed, ostensibly or otherwise, as at the Department of Commerce as a trade fair manager, and by the State Department as an interpreter. During the time we now know he helped organize and launch NICAP between approximately October 1956 and January 1957. When Director Hoover was provided copies of S.A. McCrae's November 27 report on Roquefort, he was additionally given the memo shown below, not included in the copies designated for other cleared recipients. The memo, exclusively for Hoover, contains information that is fully redacted, as is the source. The information was apparently obtained on November 2nd, 1956, just days after the formal incorporation of NICAP. Under the stipulations, it was furnished in strict confidence and not to be disseminated outside the director's office. Efforts were unsuccessful to get further declassification of the memo, curiously exclusively for Hoover. In 2021, the Bureau conducted a mandatory declassification review as requested, but declined to further declassify any of the document, citing exemption from the FOIA. For the time being, we are left to wonder the identity of the informant, the nature of the information the source wanted withheld from FBI field offices and other agencies, and if it had anything to do with Rochefort's involvement with NICAP. So let's talk about this just a little bit. You can see, November 1956 memo that is for the director's eyes only and is not to be disseminated even outside of his office to other FBI field offices, much less any other agencies. And that was a stipulation. Again, in the spirit of not mystery mongering, I will tell you, I came across some instances. I've now read pretty closely about 240, 250 pages of records on Nicolas de Rochefort. And there are some instances discussed that the informants or the people interviewed that might be referred to as informants didn't want anyone to know they told him, that were not significant, but they just personally didn't want to be the one that's talking about marital problems and things like that. I do not necessarily think that's what this is about, though, because the dates don't add up. And it is just so coincidental that it's right on that NICAP timeline, too. But for instance, de Rochefort had domestic problems. He had trouble with his wife. He had trouble in having relationships with another man's wife. And these were not deemed significant enough, obviously, by the State Department. The FBI just reports them. You know, here's what we found out. And they were not deemed significant enough, apparently, to disqualify him from the things they were wanting him to do. He did lose his employment at Georgetown University over it. Apparently, in the early 1950s, if you got divorced, you couldn't work at Georgetown. Interesting how culture changes, isn't it?
It amazes me how directly Hoover seems to be involved with everything back in the day. Like, was it standard practice for all this stuff, like anyone being investigated, for that to be forwarded to the director of the entire FBI?
That is wild, isn't it? Sometimes it's not. Like, it'll go to some of the assistant directors, and I don't know if it goes on from there or not. But by that point in time, it seems like he would have had to have limited the amount of memos he was reading, or it like loses its significance, you know, like you can't keep all that in your head. In fact, one of the things I was going to say about just the couple hundred pages we're about to go into that I've read, that's essentially a book, a book of intelligence case reports that can get overwhelming about tracking your leads. And like as you read through it, it'll refer to this memorandum is in reference to the directors, and there'll be a date memo requesting. So I'll make a note. Okay, you need to find if that memo is in these records or if you need to do a request on it. And there'll be a reference to a State Department file or an INS file or a Commerce Department file. And it'll be like, okay, either find it or request it. And you end up with this, big long list. And it's like clear that a lot of this, even as much as we got, as much as we surmise, I'm of the opinion a lot got destroyed, a lot. And, let's be realistic. I mean, you don't want to stir up conspiracies, but let's not be gullible either. I don't think they randomly decide what goes to the paper shredder, Okay. S.A. Thomas Alt investigated Rochefort between late November 1956 and early January 1957. He touched base with Colonel Splain of the Joint Chiefs, confirming previous investigation reports continued to accurately reflect the officer's high regard for Rochefort. S.A. also spoke with confidential informants in Washington familiar with Chinese affairs who advised they had no knowledge of Rochefort. Thus, the Frenchman was not suspected to be employed by nationalist China. Coincidentally or otherwise, Alt's report was dated January 11, 1957, just days before the first annual NICAP meeting of members and the Board of Governors, in which T. Townsend Brown was formally ousted. I continue to seek material on Nicolas de Rochefort through the FOIA from intelligence agencies and archives. My efforts include requesting an FBI file from the National Archives and Records Administration after the FBI advised me of its existence. NARA responded by email that a preliminary review indicated Rochefort is indeed the subject of the file, which consists of some 200 pages. It was compiled as the result of an internal security investigation conducted between 1955 and 1964. NARA further stated the file must be processed for public release. The completion date was estimated to be September 2022. During FOIA correspondence with the FBI, it indicated additional records potentially responsive to Nicolas de Rochefort were destroyed. It stated that was the case in a 2020 FOIA response. So before we go on with some of the more recently obtained records, that memo, the 1956 memo that the special agent advises Hoover that this is for your eyes only, and then redacts it. I did file an appeal since I wrote this on their denial of, they did the mandatory declassification review, but they didn't release any more of it than was already released. I did an appeal on that, and the appeal was remanded, which is a good sign. And that means they kicked it back to FBI to tell them to take another look at it. And that's the kind of things that we make the argument of, if an agency just doesn't like what it says, that doesn't necessarily mean it continues to be a national security issue. And apparently, Department of Justice attorneys thought that was a decent enough argument to at least tell FBI to take another look at it. But I still haven't gotten a final judgment on that. But I did get the 200 pages, 206 actually, from NARA. That actually was one of the things that inspired me to go ahead and do this book group at this point in time. Any comments before we go further?
I don't remember if this was covered elsewhere, but it's, it's stated he's recognized as an expert in psychological warfare. Where did he get trained in that? How did he become an expert?
Oh, wow, that's a really good question. I get the idea that he presented himself as from a noble family, that he was cultured, that he was well educated. I think most of that's true. I think his father may have been a French diplomat working in Russia, was how he met his Russian mom, and was born in St. Petersburg. I think a lot of that's true. I also think, though, that he was a resourceful and intelligent immigrant that knew how to present himself well. Like, the people the FBI talked to repeatedly say he was a good dresser, he was articulate, he made a good first impression. You had the idea you were talking to an intelligent person that could accomplish things. And some of them even expressed some surprise that they were on his list of who to talk to for his security clearance. That Splain that I mentioned, the intelligence officer, the Joint Chiefs, was one of those that said, I'm a little surprised that he mentioned me. But Splain, I think it was, or at least others also said, he's clever, and it can be difficult for immigrants to fit in and get opportunities. And de Rochefort is clever and knows how to name drop. So I'm also not surprised that he'd have the FBI up here talking to the Joint Chiefs of Staff about clearing him for a position with the State Department. And he did know Splain. It's just a security clearance, it's my understanding, is typically people you work with on a regular basis, people that you've been to their barbecues, people that can say there's nothing funny going on with this guy. And there were a couple of people that were going, he said to talk to me, huh? And Splain kind of covered that he's resourceful. He's gonna drop names, and you need 3 references. 2 of them are gonna be congressmen, and one's gonna be a 4-star general. And you're gonna be like, whoa. So I think a lot of it was true, but I think he also was clever. I hope that helps, Randy. I mean,
Yeah, I think that does. Thank you.
Like it's hard now to check if somebody claims they've got a doctorate from France. It's kind of hard to check, much less in the 1950s when they, changed governments 3 times or something. I mean, yeah, it can be tough.
Jack,
Yeah.
I was doing some researching here, I'm sure you've come across this information before, but the New York Times had in 1964 his obituary in the paper, which and then I found, it turns out that it's not Berlin, New Hampshire, it is Berlin.
Ah,
They changed the pronunciation during World War I as a patriotic stand against Germany. Where it is located is 60 miles from Quebec. And so there were French, so many of the people were French Canadian in descent, which, because I was thinking, why was he in Berlin? That would make sense if he would migrate or live or show up or know people that were French Canadian.
thank you. Yes, it would. It's also addressed in the records that there were people that were opposed to the honoring of anything German at that point in time. And that was one of the things that Congress and people he impressed noted, was that he presented himself as a French POW and that he was like putting a hand across the aisle. And I have good reason to believe he was pretty extreme right politically too. But as has been said, he was resourceful and persuasive.
I then found from the Berlin Historical Society, it's called the Brown Bulletin. This is from
Yes.
1954, where there are pictures of, wow, this is a good resource here, of the Freedom Day. And I can get sort of the propaganda, propaganda can be good as well. It doesn't have to be nefarious, right? If you're trying to encourage a population to do something positive. So it says here that, it says, Berlin's Freedom Day, an answer to communist domination. It said the Voice of America beamed the program in 3 different languages to the enslaved people throughout the world, giving them encouragement and support in their constant effort to shake themselves loose from their red handcuffs. National magazines and news services were also on hand to report the Freedom Day story. And Berlin was filled with proud people who were happy to make that story possible. And so it was trying to link Berlin, New Hampshire with East Berlin, Germany. So if you looked at it as positive propaganda, I can make that link.
Yes, there is definitely something to be said about, if I don't know why people were doing things they were doing, I can't necessarily pass judgment. And I'll even say about current times, I mean, I get impatient and annoyed with some of the UAP, UFO disclosure stuff and the intelligence officers involved in it now. But no, I don't really know why. So For all I know, lives might be saved through catching spies, for all I know. I don't know.
Then there was a proclamation from the governor that talked about in East Berlin, Germany, June 17th, 1953, 1 year ago, occurrences took place which shook the world. The workers of East Berlin, Germany, rose against their communist puppet masters, forced on them by the Soviet military might. And it goes on. So it was meant to encourage other people. Whereas truth on the scaffold was victorious, there was exposed once and for all as a lie the myth that communism is for the people and for the workers. Communism was unmasked for what it is, a shameless exploiter and tramper upon all human rights. So it was to spread the word against communism.
Right, right. And he's largely credited with Freedom Day being his baby. Yeah.
Yeah. And if he was captive and he became free, then I could see how this all came to be.
Yes.
And maybe government officials would be interested in his time in captivity.
Right. And as we know, government officials are interested in what's popular. Like if people like this guy and there's a bandwagon, well then they're gonna want on it, you know. Thank you, Sharon. Okay, the records more recently found, or not found, but obtained as part of that original request way back in 2020, but just now obtained, include records on 1950s, early 1960s. You can see here he used some aliases. Nicholas Hardstone, as I understand it, was a pen name. He wrote a lot of political articles in France, and that was the name he used. I do not know why Armand Duplessis is, and again, I'm sure I'm butchering the pronunciation there. I do not know why that is an alias at this point. It is not explained in the records, which there again is an indication of lost, destroyed, whatnot records, or just somewhere else under some different type of category. This was an interesting point for me too. It established, FBI documented that in 1950, he expressed a desire to lend assistance to the Bureau in any possible way. And he furnished information to the FBI in connection with another investigation conducted in 1951. And there is not details of that in any of the records I have. So I don't know what that was about. Coincidentally, it's on the timeline with when they were talking to Ivan Sanderson and the people in New York about the New York Saucer Information Bureau, but I do not, that could be complete coincidence. But I don't know what was going on in 1951 that he had information about. And here is just an example of what we see repeatedly in his records, where on that NICAP bullseye of when NICAP was incorporated and launched, and Townsend Brown was ousted and Kehoe was put in. This was part of an international investigation they were doing on de Rochefort. Department of State established that the French ambassador to Germany stated he was very familiar with de Rochefort and was sure that if the American government offered him a post, he will give every satisfaction. And this was an interesting point too in the most recently obtained records. It established that Congressman Judd sent a letter to the director of the Office of International Trade Fairs, and he stated that he thought so highly of de Rochefort. This letter was written in 1955, that he personally introduced him to Secretary of State John Dulles and CIA Director Allen Dulles. And you can see that's followed by some redacted lines under exemption B3, intelligence sources and methods. And that's what I was referring to earlier that I have already appealed. I sent an appeal in on these records. And this was from an investigation they were doing, I think, for the Civil Service Commission, that in, I think it was 1956, this was de Rochefort self-reporting that he had worked in American propaganda and did research for a U.S. government agency from 1952 to 1954, and that he had been in American propaganda from 1950 to present. And here is his self-reporting in 1958 of his employment. We can see that starting at the bottom, he was employed with Fordham University in Georgetown while he claimed to be doing various things. And then he repeatedly, as you can see with U.S. government, Washington, D.C. in 1952 to 1954, there are repeated circumstances in the records where he simply says he's not at liberty to discuss or elaborate on what was taking place. That would certainly support investigative journalists like Bachrach's concerns that he was CIA and that the CIA was behind the Committee for 1 Million. And then we're right into the Advertising Council and employment at the State Department. And his affiliation with NICAP is curiously completely absent from all of the records I have obtained, unless it's behind some redactions or destroyed. He doesn't even report what he was doing between October 56 and January 57 here. He just does not fill in that time. There is a blog post covering these newly obtained records at the Expanding Frontiers Research blog, and I will include a link along with some other things that we've discussed, like the Brown Bulletin Sharon came across is an extremely interesting resource. And for a lot of things, I think we're left to materials like that to try to piece this together. As we've discussed before, these intelligence professionals don't leave a whole lot of clues to follow around. We're not in a Nicolas Cage movie here. If they didn't want you to know something, there's a real good chance you're not gonna know it. But
I learned.
what say you?
I learned this is probably common knowledge, but I learned from the book, The Fort Bragg Cartel, that oftentimes this was applied to the military and maybe people in special forces, that then they'll put out enough information. For example, but wherever online, we'll put out enough information that's almost correct, but we'll change some details of maybe school or dates or whatever that would make a person go, oh, maybe that's a misprint, or which one is it? But there's enough that's truthful in there that people would accept it as like, oh, okay, this must be factual.
Yeah, that's a good point too. Thank you. We were discussing earlier that the FBI, to their credit, would talk to a lot of people and get a lot of narratives, but ultimately they'd end up with a lot of conflicting information. And I think some of that's by design, what people leave in their wake, like de Rochefort had stories floating around that he had brilliantly deceived the Germans into releasing him from a prisoner of war camp. But the FBI also came across people in their international investigations with State Department that had heard that he was sympathetic to the Germans, the Nazis, and that he may have had connections that got him released. And that's just gonna happen when and it's basically all just rumors, And one person that they interviewed about that in particular, that was that they were investigating rapidly, trying to investigate with urgency if de Rochefort had fascist sympathies. Someone said something along the lines of, when hostile forces occupy your government, you might just have to do what you got to do to survive. And then maybe he should be best judged by what he's done lately, kind of thing. And there's just going to be a lot of conflicting narratives. Like, I have some understandings of, like, in Eastern Europe, as the Soviets would occupy nations and then fall back, that it would become difficult for the residents in those nations to straighten out their loyalties, because you got to be loyal to the former government till the Soviets are there. Then you got to be all, saluting the Soviets. Then when the Soviets are gone, you got to make sure that you don't get thrown in with the Soviet occupation. And so I think the FBI just was turning over their rumors to the State Department and to the trade commissions and whatnot, and let them just decide what they wanted to do. And the bottom line, as Sharon observed from the Brown Bulletin, was the guy was doing things they wanted him to do and doing good work, so they wanted to go with it. And then he decided to be a UFO investigator. As you'll do.
As one does.
As one does. That's right.
Well, as we're finding, as one does, there's a lot of them that indeed did that.
Yes, there is. There is. There's a few more paragraphs here. I'll go ahead and wrap it up, so we'll be finished with this chapter. There was, the matter of Bernard J.O. Carvalho that was also said by Todd Zeckel and others to be CIA. There is much less information available on Rochefort partner in, well, whatever they were partners in, Bernard J.O. Carvalho. You will recall Mr. Carvalho joined Rochefort and Brown as an early NICAP organizer and was accused of being a CIA man by people ranging from Richard Hall to Todd Zeckel and many in between and since. Among the few things I located was an old story in which Carvalho is a supporting character and was described as a director of publications and former reporter who was helping Ivy Ducey publicize God Speaks. There's a lot to unpack in that sentence, but here we go. Ivy Onelte Ducey was a female Murshida, or spiritual guide of Sufism. Reoriented, which was an American school of spiritualist training. Sufism Reoriented was started by Meher Baba, considered by some a spiritual master and the author of the book, God Speaks. The story comes to us from July 1956 and concerns a publicity tour for Meher Baba. He was being filmed conducting his activities and departing from New York. The entourage was destined for Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, where Meher Baba was scheduled to participate in dedication ceremonies for the Meher Spiritual Center. There was apparently pre-flight engine trouble and a storm, but Carvalho must have been pretty hell-bent on getting the master and some television cameramen to that gig in Myrtle Beach. It would seem securing and flying airplanes on short notice numbered among Carvalho's abilities and talents, assuming this is the Bernard Carvalho in question, which I obviously suspect to be the case. NBC TV cameramen were to come from New York and film the proceedings for the nationally televised Dave Caraway show, a blogger recounted, but their flight was canceled due to engine trouble. However, Bernard Carvalho found a small private plane and flew them through a storm to Myrtle Beach. After a long search, according to one of the blogger's cited sources, Bernard Carvalho finally found a small private plane and flew them himself through a storm to Myrtle Beach. Carvalho was apparently not a big fan of layovers, at least not in this particular instance. Barry Greenwood gave me a heads up by email. There is almost nothing available on Carvalho in the NICAP files and material. With very fragmentary information, Greenwood added, I gathered that de Rochefort and Carvalho were brought on by Townsend Brown to fundraise, but due to questionable financial activities, they appear to have been gone by the time Kehoe took hold. There is no evidence either were into UFOs otherwise. Indeed, there is not. There's no reason to think either of the two had any existing interest in UFOs when they got on board with NICAP. It is time to follow the money. Isn't it always? My personal opinion, along with whatever we had been discussing potential FBI and CIA interests in NICAP. I think that's there too. When there's money and public interest, the intelligence agencies are going to become interested. Like they don't want to, it's my opinion, they don't want this narrative to get away from, you know. And if there's money to be made, we know what they were doing in the 1950s. I mean, with creative fundraising and using nonprofits to move money around. Any closing thoughts, anybody?
I was just going to say, I was not expecting a Meher Baba reference in this book. That was quite a surprise.
Yeah, that's wild, isn't it? And you've got like Carvalho at that assignment, whatever he was doing. That's sort of similar to what Joseph Bryan did, that Jeff and I were talking about, that he wrote about famous people and interviewed them, and internationally, but not just Americans, but people of interest internationally. And I can see where intelligence agencies might, like, that would be good cover to position people. You know, it's always been journalists that you know, have CIA and intelligence ties as they go to sensitive areas that may have wars or conflicts. And I can see where the different spiritualist movements would be similar to UFOs in that they're wanting to keep a finger on that pulse and know what's going on. And I was indeed being kind of sarcastic in there about, if you're to think that this was not an intelligence asset, this guy sure seemed to have a lot of urgency about getting that entourage through a storm to South Carolina. It's not just everybody that can find a plane. And what do you know? He knows how to fly it too. Like will Peter Falk play him in the movie? You know. Anything else, guys? Well, I really thank you for joining me. I really appreciate your time and attention, your input. Considering these circumstances, we are really getting into the thick of it now as we continue to consider board members and even their families and things that were going on. If you're joining us on YouTube, thanks for checking it out. Check out the links in the video description where you will find show notes and things that of interest, different resources. Visit us at expandingfrontiersresearch.org. Visit our Patreon, where we have lots of resources there as well. And please consider chipping in at our GoFundMe if you find this helpful and entertaining and interesting. And again, thank you all for joining me. I'm Jack Brewer with Expanding Frontiers Research, and thank you.